Welcome to episode 5 of the Mission Thriving Life podcast. We're glad to have you. This podcast is designed specifically to help you thrive rather than just survive the challenges of life, leadership, and faith. My name is Joel, and I am joined today by Steve Carter and Ben Reed. I'll get to them in just a minute. Steve preached this last weekend as we continued our series in the meantime, and Ben's our adult ministries pastor here at the church. We're going to have a very personal and practical conversation about what it is to keep the main thing, which was the idea of the message this last week. Before we jump in, I just want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified each time we post new content. Also, if you find this helpful, we'd love for you to share it with friends so that they can benefit from it as well. Well, this last weekend, we continued our series in the meantime, and it was a thrill to have you here, Steve. It's been the first time in a long time. You're not a stranger to Mission, but it was awesome to have you here this last weekend. And I personally found your message super challenging and really practical. In fact, you and I had a personal conversation about one specific part of it that was super challenging to me. So thank you for that personally. My wife thanks you as well. We had a great conversation after the message. Can you just give us a little bit of background on where did this come from for you and sort of where was sort of the beginnings of this message? Because I know you've given it in multiple contexts before being here at Mission. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So thanks for having me on the podcast. And I would say, a number of years ago, I think it was probably 2009, finding myself staying at this vineyard and getting the privilege to just follow this vine dresser around for 4 early mornings. And I'm one of those guys, and I think you're very similar, Joel, but when you learn something, you almost want to you learn it better when it's hands-on. Like when you get to touch it, smell it, feel it, it just somehow it comes to life. And so that has just been kind of stirring in me. And I might have gave a message on it in 2014. And so it was kind of just there. And probably every season or two, I try to have a rally cry, something that kind of is the anthem for the season. And as all of this COVID stuff was taking place, I realized there's a lot of things that are out of my control, but what is in my control is the decision each and every day to keep the main thing. And so it kind of resurfaced and reemerged for me. And so
that's so good. And just even as you were preaching on Sunday, I mean, I literally was sitting there thinking, gosh, there's so many in the spirit of what do you do when there's nothing else you can do? It's like, this is something you can do. There's a lot we can't do right now, but this is something you can take control of. And there's a lot of things that are out of our control, but I just thought it was such and you're right. And I don't know if this is true for you, but specifically for me with messages, there are messages that sometimes I need to re-preach for me.
Yeah.
Totally. I'm almost this is a reminder for me. And I think, well, if I need this reminder, we probably all need this reminder. And so that's cool.
And this is a little bit my always tension with worship pastors. We always joke back and forth about this. I'm like, you get to sing the song you wrote 3 weeks in a row. And I get to give a message once and then it gets put on the back shelf for ever, And so I think that there are those times where, man, this is a song I need to sing for me. I need to be reminded of it. And so I totally resonate with what you just said.
No, and this is completely off subject and not in the script, but this is what the ancients in our faith did all the time. They recited the truths of the scriptures of the Torah over and over. They memorized them and they would say them over and over. They would read them over and over. They would just stand up and recite the same things. It wasn't hey, I'm going to show up at church hoping I hear something I've never heard before, which is that's our culture. So,
and I think it's so funny too. I mean, you say that this started back in 2009 for you, and back in 2009, you had no clue that we'd be in the middle of this season. So it's funny how God uses something that was 11 years ago to now specifically in this moment, in this strange season we find ourselves in, to speak right to us.
Yeah.
Right.
Ben, you were in the post-service chat, which if you attend Mission and you haven't been to the post-service chat, there's always great conversations. I haven't made all of them, but I've made a lot of them.
You promised you'd make
I know. This last week I made one of 3.
It's okay.
I tried.
You did. You did. You get an A for effort.
One of 3. But just such rich conversations. Tell us a little bit about some of the conversations you guys were having this past weekend.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this to you a few minutes ago, but I think you're up against a real challenge this week because people have connected so much with Joel every single week, and we've loved seeing Joel and hearing Joel, and then to drop in somebody. I mean, I've been here almost 3 years now, and I didn't know your voice. You haven't been here since I've been here, but our people connected with you right out of the gate. And I think there were two things that kind of bubbled to the surface. One was the idea, like the part of the illustration where you drew the cross in the middle of the vine, and how like Jesus is right there in the middle of our pruning, doing incredible work. And I felt like a lot of the conversation revolved around that. And then the other revolved around when you talked about pinching the bloom, because so many people had, they felt like they were kind of on track in life. They were following Jesus. They're doing all the right things, yet they got pinched, and were left really confused. And so I think you were able to put words to what they were sensing and didn't know how to move forward through. And it felt like that was kind of a breakthrough on the discussion afterwards, was people going, I don't know why God did that. I felt like I was doing all the right things, yet now maybe I kind of get a glimpse of what he might have been up to.
I will say one fail in the message, though. I just was waiting for you to say, and the guy dropped to his knees and he gave his life to Christ. What was the deal with that, dude?
I know, man.
You're an evangelist.
I know,
You
it's
didn't
like,
lead this guy to the Lord?
I can do it. I can do it.
Man.
I tried. I even bought more bottles of wine from him. I was trying.
You were doing
but
everything you could.
It's almost like what Ben was saying. It was the not yet for him. So,
I will say I've never heard that before. And that whole idea of that pinching or that being squeezed, like we've all felt that. And like to know that that's positive, like to go, hey, you know what, that feeling can be good. That feeling can be fruitful. It can actually cause you to bear better fruit later on. Man, that was so powerful. So let me just jump to this. Like, do you guys, either one of you, have something you feel like a specific season that maybe even some of the circumstances surrounding it where there was something that you were like, you know what, this was a season where, because you talked about trusting the pruning and then, trusting the process and trusting the promise that's on the other side of that. Tell me about a practical season when you went through something where you had to experience that, and maybe, some of the challenges of trusting the process and trusting the pruning and the promise in the middle of that.
well, I think as Ben talks about this, is sometimes you feel like you're doing the right thing, and you're still getting the not yet.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you make sense of that? And then there's some times when you're in seasons where and Tiger Woods did this, he wins the Masters, and he comes back and goes, I still need to work on my swing. And so there's seasons when you know that there's still another level for you to get to, that you go, I got to actually go back and really work on some area of my life. And for me, the fruit that I always want to bear and cultivate in my life is the fruit of the Spirit. And so constantly I'm looking at each one of those, love, peace, joy, patience, kindness, goodness, all self-control. And I'm looking at my life going, where am I, if you ask my wife or you ask my kids, where am I not bearing that? So then what do I need to do in my life to actually cultivate self-control?
Yeah.
And so there's been seasons where I've had to learn how to say no. I think part of me has been built around achievement and built around people pleasing. And so part of my identity's been in the performance, not in the sense of, no, you're okay.
Yeah.
You're okay, and now you bring your best because you come from a place of you're beloved by God. So there's been these moments of pruning where I feel like,
no,
God,
I need that one. I
yeah,
need that limb. No, don't cut that one off. I need that.
Yeah, I'm like, you can cut that thing off, but like I need to hold on to this. So for me, it's been recently, truly, it's been around self-control. I think the other thing, even in the COVID time, I've been really spending a lot of time on Philippians 2, when it says, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus. And then a verse or two before that, it says, value others above yourself. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? And in a world right now where I sometimes can compare, or I sometimes can look and go, why are they given why I don't even think they're saying things that are helping
Yeah.
people. They're creating more fear. And yet I have to go, okay, what's that in me? And I just feel the spirit like of God with a kind of a sledgehammer beginning to go after some of those pieces. So it's
That was
really
a word
personal.
straight for me. To
So it's the posture that I think more open I am, I feel like allow God to move. How about you, Ben?
No, that's really good. I could camp out there a long time. And I relate to that a lot as well, the performance side of it. And I feel like that's one aspect that God's been pruning in me too. And I read a couple of books recently, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and To Hell with the Hustle, that
It's a good book.
they both
are all about this.
they really are.
In a lot
And
of ways.
how it's so easy for, and I won't say for you, I'll say for me, it's so easy for me to find my value and my worth in what I've done rather than in who God has declared that I am. So God's been working on the same thing in me. As I look back across my life, though, so that's kind of maybe the more positive pruning. My wife and I experienced a couple of miscarriages, and I feel like walking through that season was one that I really didn't see coming. Like I could almost see okay, you need to slow down and you need to not place your value in what people say, but in who God has declared that you are. I can kind of see that one coming.
Yeah.
But a miscarriage, we didn't see that coming at all, right? I mean, we were doing the right things. I was a pastor, and I was doing, all of my quiet times and attending church. And like I checked all the boxes, yet God asked us to walk through this. And I wish that it was just once, but it was twice. And those are hard seasons. And I think what God was pruning and shaping in me was of a level of empathy that I didn't have before. That I think I would have been a little more cavalier in my response, especially to another guy whose spouse had gone through it. I would have said, come on, but you didn't experience this, but now I have a completely different understanding of what that looks like that I wouldn't have had my wife and I not walked through that. So that was a pruning that one hurt. And I wouldn't wish that kind of pruning on anybody, but I think and again, to go back to the conversation from Sunday, nobody wants to walk through the pruning, but everybody wants the fruit on the other side. And I think you just can't get to the fruit without the pruning that happens.
And that's much of the biblical story, right? You have Egypt, the desert, the promised land. A number of years ago, I found myself in Jerusalem, and I'm outside the temple. I see this rabbi, start having a conversation with him. We chop it up a little bit. And I just started asking him a question about Egypt, desert, promised land. And I'm like, hey, random, in your mind, what's like the percentage breakdown of how long we're supposed to be in Egypt, how long we're supposed to be in the desert, how long we're supposed to be in the promised land? And he looks at me and goes, you Americans are so funny. He goes, you think that the majority of your life is supposed to be in the promised land. We see 15% in Egypt and probably 10 or 15% in the promised land, but we see 70-75% in the desert.
It's the bell curve.
It is, yeah. You know what I mean? And I think Ben, what you're saying is like nobody chooses the desert.
Yeah.
Nobody chooses
Except for us. We live
Exactly,
here.
That's right. But it's like it's the sense of like, do you choose to walk in those seasons where you feel forsaken? Do you choose those seasons where you're like, prune me?
Yeah.
Do you like, because you actually believe on the other side there's something better? We just want to skip that. We want to microwave spiritual formation, which is impossible to do.
Which is interesting because it's like sometimes you're in Egypt and you don't realize it. And so this is my story. You brought that up, and literally the first thing that came to mind for me was I literally was called to the desert. Before we moved here, I wouldn't have said I was in Egypt, but I learned some really big lessons after moving here about specifically they were related to identity, and there was a pruning that went there. I didn't realize the associations that I had in my life that were my identity. I lived in a neighborhood with my brother and my sister and their kids, and I had baptized many of my neighbors, and we had this solid community. And the mayor of the town was one of my good friends, and Andy Stanley's my boss, and I got to be a part of I was the first intern at North Point. Like, there were all these things that I sort of associated with, and that were a big part of my identity, and it took me a while to realize, once those things were pruned, and that was actually in some ways spiritually Egypt for me, and I was sort of enslaved to things that were of this world, even though they were being leveraged and they were connected to things that were eternal. Like, they were things that, the big lesson I learned was that association forges identity. I think that's why the Apostle Paul always started his writings with Paul, a slave, like a bondservant to Christ Jesus. He was clear that association was, and the more he associated himself with Christ and his suffering and his challenge, that the more he would be identified with the life of Christ in him. And so it's funny, I think there's seasons where things get taken from us or pruned. And I just, we felt like this is what God was leading us to. And it's no secret. I've talked to our church, like, it didn't have anything to do with anybody here or anything that was happening here. We just didn't want to give up where we were. And so it was a calling, like, God led us here. And we were like, not happy about it at the beginning, and it was because all we could see was what we were losing. Yeah. And it took me a while to realize that part of what I lost was chains, and that I left slavery, but then we were in a desert season where it was hard and it was challenging, and we thought, we're doing what God asked us to do. He called us, we're headed to the promised land. Yeah. Like, if we just follow Christ, if we say yes, we're going to the promised land. And so I love your rabbi friend who's going, no, a big part of life is the desert, and the promised land is going to be worth it. Yeah. Totally. Like, that's what you got to understand.
Totally. And it's one thing to leave Egypt. It's another thing to have Egypt leave you. And I think those pieces where we get those little hits from, you know what I mean? A little stroke of the ego, a little sense of like, you're doing good, you're enough, and I had it. I was living in Chicago for 7 years, and very similar, to what you got to experience at North Point. And I mean, chaplaincy, doing stuff with the Bears. I mean, like, all of that. You just get these little, like, man, I'm awesome. And then all of a sudden it's like, it's taken away overnight. And then all of a sudden you're like, I now don't have that stuff. And so we move out.
So where's my joy?
Exactly. And I'm literally on a Tuesday afternoon, we just moved here because I felt like God told me to go to the desert and wait for instructions. So we moved here. It's a Tuesday afternoon. We've ordered a washer and dryer. So a Home Depot delivery guy shows up, and I'm not usually home at 1:30. I'm usually working. I'm home. And I have all of this stuff going through my head, like, what's this guy thinking why I'm home? He's probably thinking, oh, cool, it's gonna make it easier for me. I got some help to, like, lift this up to the second story. But in
that's
my
not
mind,
what you were thinking.
No, my thought is, like, he probably thinks, like, I don't have a job, which I didn't. He's probably thinking, like, all these, and all of a sudden I feel this rush, guys, of, like, stories that I want to tell him about things I've done in my former life, to give him some sense of, hey, I'm awesome. Like, I could feel, and I felt like God saying, like, this is why you're in the desert.
And how long did the Israelites wander in the desert? 40 years. Yeah. And yet we find ourselves slipping into it after 4 days.
Totally.
But I also think about how when the Israelites were in the desert, and how foolish it seems to us now that they were saying, Moses, why'd you take us out of this? Just take us back to slavery in Egypt. And we read that and go, that's the dumbest thing ever. Why would they ask to go back to slavery? Yet, we ask the same things when we find ourselves in the desert, in the pruning season. In that time, we're going, oh, but I want to tell you about my slavery.
It was better when I didn't know.
Right, yeah.
It's better when I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah. And you feel like you have some sense of control over, like, I know this is bad, but I know I can deal with that crazy.
Yeah, it's familiar.
It's familiar.
It's consistent. Yeah. So interestingly enough, your message from this weekend, it looks different in different seasons, but whether you're in Egypt, whether you're in the desert, whether in the Promised Land, the people of God always had a difficult time remaining, staying connected to Him. So I want to get super practical about, like, what are some ways that we do that and we keep the main thing. Because I'll just say this, and I told you guys this earlier, like, for me, at some point in my life, college, post college, I had a few mentors in my life, and it was like, hey, it was sort of like, spiritual boot camp, and it's like, here's what you do. Like, if you want to stay connected to God, if you want to be like David, you want to be a man after God's own heart, here's what you do. You have to rise early, get up first thing in the morning. You're going to do a quiet time. You're going to spend time reading your Bible and praying, and you're going to do that every day. And if you don't do that every day, like, pardon my language, but you suck as a Christian. And it's like,
are you really saved if you
so
don't
for
do
a
that
long time, I just felt like I sucked as a Christian. Yeah. Like, it's like, that's where I was. And then I remember somebody introduced me to the idea of, that people have different spiritual pathways. And later I got introduced to Gary Thomas's book, Sacred Pathways. If you've never read it, it's a little bit of a dry read, but it's really helpful. And when I was introduced to this idea, it was so freeing, because I thought, because I wasn't doing it this way, the way this, the boot camp guy told me I should do it, I just thought, like, there's something wrong with me. Like, I don't love God, and then when I started to realize other ways that I connect with God, that I stay connected to God, because I'm an enthusiast, for me, there's so much about worship, and I'm a naturalist, nature, which is funny. My third one's contemplative, but not the necessarily the mental side, but more of the reflecting on and making sure, like, the self examination, and making sure my life is fully surrendered and devoted to God. Like, those were sort of ways that for me, like, I study to preach. That doesn't do anything for my personal relationship with God. I don't know about you. Like, some people, I hear pastors talk all the time. It's like, no, when I study, like, I feel connected to God. I don't feel that way. I mean, I don't not enjoy it, but it doesn't move the needle on my relationship with God. I'm fascinated by things. I'm a learner. I love history, but like, that doesn't, that's all I did, that wouldn't be remaining for me. Mm-hmm. And so personal worship, getting out in nature, like things like that and when somebody told me, well, that's how you should do it then. That's how you should connect with God. Someone told me, you like to ride your bike. You should get on your bike, put on your worship music, and go ride in beautiful scenery. And it's like, wait, that's what remaining is like? Yeah. And like, so I'm just curious for you guys, like, because I think there's a lot of people listening that are like, they think, okay, yeah, I didn't have my quiet time. I didn't do my devotional today. And so I'm not doing what Steve said. I'm not keeping the main thing. Now, that's a pathway for some people. And certainly we need to be open in the scriptures and things like that. So I'm not saying anything against that, but like, tell me for you guys, like, what does it look like for you?
Yeah, for me, so I grew up in a like conservative Southern Baptist culture, which I'm not disparaging that at all. I'm thankful for that in so many ways, but in a similar way to the boot camp idea, I grew up with this mindset that, well, if I do my quiet time, then I'm connected to God, and if I don't, then that connection is lost. It's over. Mm-hmm. So I felt myself like cycling in and out of guilt. Like, if I would do it at a different time of day, I was like, well, I didn't do it in the morning, so I didn't check the box right. And then I found myself, speaking of checking the boxes, I found myself just going through the motions so that I could say that I'm remaining rather than actually remaining. Well, what I found is two for me. It's the intellectual side. So I love reading, and it's so funny to hear you say that that's like, as you're preparing sermons, you're preparing talks, that doesn't like deeply connect you with God. It so does for me. Yeah. Like, that's worship for me. And so cool. I love when I'm able to spend extended amount of time doing that, because that causes me to remain like almost nothing else. And then it's some sort of, for me, like a combination of nature and being outside. And I'm a runner, and so I love running or hiking or working out. And for me, and again, to go back to my past, nobody would have ever told me growing up, well, like, you can actually connect with God doing that. Mm-hmm. So when I came across this concept that you're talking about, Joel, with these pathways, it was so freeing for me to realize, mm-hmm. because I was deeply connected with God. It just didn't feel like in my mind it checked that box. And so I still felt guilty. Yeah. But now it feels so freeing to go, No, as I can connect with God in both of those really significant ways.
Yep.
I had a great mentor who kind of broke down the sacred pathways thing, but did it in a way that I think was really helpful for me as an athlete, and just said, hey, there's different offenses, and so whether it's basketball, whether it's football, there's some guys who find themselves in a system, a new offensive coordinator comes, and they don't match the system. So what do they have to do? They got to transfer. Why? Because the system didn't allow them to produce the way that they would want to.
Yep.
So you have to get really curious to what system will you produce the best in, and become comfortable with that, name that. And one of the things that he would say is, and if you played basketball, played college, played high school, you remember every practice began with you running the free throw line, jump stop, running to the half court line, jump stop. And he just said, hey, there's fundamentals that you want to hold on to. And so whether reading the Bible, you love it like Ben, and you just come alive or not, I always just say to everyone, like, just let that be like a little fundamental. If it's like one verse, 2 verses, but like that doesn't have to be everything. For me, when I lived in Southern California, I loved to paddleboard. And I would just listen to the Bible as I paddleboard.
Yep.
And I would listen to worship. It was almost being read over and sung over me, which was really helpful. I need to be in nature. I need to be active. And I need to almost like be in situations that, and this is a little bit of surfing metaphor, but like where the waves are over my head, that I need to depend more on God. And I find that's where I grow the most, in God's word, but also in nature, in some sense of like something being sung, read over me, contemplative, and in seasons where, God, I need you to show up. I need you to guide me through this.
Yeah, it's funny. That's so similar to me because that's what I started doing. I'd not only listen to worship music, I would listen to the Bible.
Yeah.
And there was something about that when it was being read to me and I wasn't studying it. It was just, and I don't mind sharing this. You said in your sermon Sunday, you said, when we study, we ask questions of the text. Like that's the part I mean. Like me asking questions of the text and studying, investigating for whatever reason doesn't make me feel connected to God. But when I allow it to speak to me, I allow it to ask questions of my life. Like when somebody's reading it to me or teaching it to me. So I would listen to the Bible. I would listen to other people teach the Bible. When I hear it asking questions of me, it is when I feel connected to God. And I think it's great you talk about the fundamentals because part of the way you have to remain in the vine is you got to listen.
Right.
And so God speaks through his word, through prayer, through other people. Like, so there's all these ways, which leads me to like, a good spiritual rhythm. Like I think when you say, keep the main thing, every day I got to choose. Well, how am I going to choose today? The reality is on Sunday, I choose to go show up at church every Sunday.
Right.
On Monday, it might look like I sit down and I read a devotional or I spend some time or I go to a Bible study with some guys in the morning or I have a small group gathering that I go to or, I show up online at a night of prayer and worship or whatever it is. Yeah. You listen to a podcast or you listen to some scriptures. You go for a ride or you get on a paddleboard. I think that's the thing though. And, not being discouraged if, today I didn't make that a part of my rhythm. It's like, but realizing that the more I do that, the more I stay connected, the better the fruit that I'm going to bear, and I love the analogy, not just because, it was a metaphor that Jesus used, but I love the analogy because of the actual process. And I don't want to get too, over super spiritualized things, but I think all of God's creation has an order. There's a created order to it that's reflected throughout. These are transferable things because they reflect the Creator.
Yeah. And
in the same way that God created the process of the way wine was developed in a way that makes it a really great, drink, a great bottle of wine, it's the same way in which it creates great fruit or the fruit of the Spirit comes out of our lives. And a lot of that takes time. A minute ago, you were mentioning the season you and Laura went through. And, I just started thinking, I didn't really know you a lot before that. I just knew you a little bit before that, and to see your compassion, to see your love, to see your kindness with people differently because of that. I just think, that took time. It took a difficult season. It took a desert season to get through that. And so, I think it's important for people to know, like, hey, you got to figure out, we talked about rhythm on the podcast a few weeks ago, what your spiritual rhythm and what are those things you incorporate. You may connect with God differently, but just making sure you have a healthy spiritual rhythm. Just before we wrap up, I want to talk about some tools in just a second. What are some indicators? Do you guys have any indicators of a healthy spiritual rhythm? Like, what would you say people should pay attention to?
I'll say what's an indicator of a non-healthy spiritual rhythm is when you find yourself distancing yourself from people, and not social distancing, but I mean, like emotionally and then even physically, like removing yourself from healthy people. And I've been in ministry long enough now that I've noticed when people do that, that's the time I call them, I text them, I want to check in, because it feels like when they haven't checked in the group, they haven't been there in a while, or they haven't been a part of this ministry that they were so invested in, even weeks before or months before. I think that's a leading indicator that you need to make sure that rhythm is built in your life. Yep. I mean, I talked about the intellectual side and the nature side, but part of me, I feed off of Jesus and other people. So it's not just I need quiet time, just me and Jesus. I told my small group this just the other night. I was having a rough week, but I heard Jesus in one other guy in our group, and that completely changed my week. Because I think God's wired us to be interconnected with one another, and so that, like, when I'm cycling down and you're cycling up, I think we feed each other that way. So I think that's a leading indicator. When you find yourself distancing from people, it's a leading indicator on the wrong side.
That's good.
Yeah, you take it back to the gym. You sometimes can walk around when we used to be able to go work out at the gym, and you'd see some guys who have just only worked out one muscle, right? And I think sometimes that happens in our faith journeys. And so we'll see people who just read their Bible. And so they're strong in one area. And I think what we've got to be able to do is, my buddy talks about it like a drum. And if like a drum, they've got those lug nuts. And sometimes when they get loose, the sound just kind of like murmurs. But you want that like to be a tight sound, a tight hit. And so I think about those indicators of like, how am I doing in community? What's like my relationship with the larger church, like the church family? What does service and being on mission look like? What's my evangelism? Who am I reaching out, and the invitational life kind of stuff? How's my time with Jesus going? How's my marriage? Like, there are these questions that I feel like when those are tight, I can tell when I'm not showing up to church, or when I'm not actually using the gifts that God's given to me. Or when I'm not spending time with God in my unique way, when I'm not reaching out to community, all of those are going to affect my heart, my soul, and then I'm going to start distancing.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's like, okay, I have to often, like once a month, and usually every season, my wife and I will just look at the drum and say, okay, how are we doing in these areas? How are we doing? And it's just a good checkup for us. Yeah.
Not to be too cheesy, similar to me, but I even evaluate those things one level down. Like, if Jesus said we would be known by his followers as his love, or by our love, we would be known as connected to him.
Yeah.
And so, like, at that 1 Corinthians 13's been that thing for me that I go, if I'm impatient, if I'm not kind, if I'm envious, if I'm prone to sort of focus on my achievements and want to get credit and boast, like, I know that I'm not remaining, I'm not connected. And so I evaluate those categories, but I do it through that lens of how do I interact in those areas.
Yeah.
And in fact, we just like a few nights ago, I was having conversation with two buddies of mine about this very thing, and we're just talking about how to be mindful in this season and be thoughtful and go, hey, how do I evaluate the previous season of my life? And we talked about this in the next series. We're gonna talk all about that, like. What do we go back to? Should we go back?
Yep.
And what are the things that need to be recovered and what are the things that don't need to be recovered? And so we were just having a really honest conversation about that. And we were talking about 1 Corinthians 13 and just talking about categories and areas and people and relationships and, just trying to figure out like what in this season may God not just be holding back, but pruning, like that shouldn't come back. 'Cause it's so relevant in this season. Like there's a lot of things that we think, oh, that's not being pruned. I'm just missing that for a season. It's like, no. God's going, no. I'm pruning that. Like I'm cutting that off.
Yep.
Like you don't need that. That's not good for you. And so it's good. Quickly, couple tools. You guys have any tools of how things you use or people could use in terms of remaining or keeping the main thing, the main thing?
Well, I mean, and I'm on the intellectual side. I love reading. So for me, I actually don't typically read a physical Bible. I do YouVersion, and I follow a plan on there. And again, that's because I am going to tend to check the boxes.
Yep.
But that's okay. And if maybe that's you too. Maybe you love to check the boxes. YouVersion helps you do that. My two
Great.
favorite.
There's so many Bible reading plans on there too.
Tons.
There's all sorts of great.
Tons.
Don't be overwhelmed. Just find one and go for it.
Yeah, and then there's two devotionals that I love that I found myself keep coming back to. One is it's called A Godward Life by John Piper, and there's 3 books, which actually I don't even know how many. Each book has like 120 or 180 different devotionals. It's a ton, and I love it's super practical. It's a verse connected to something and something you see, and then driving the truth home, and then. Paul Tripp has one that he just came out with called New Morning Mercies that I feel like I consume it. I can't get enough of it. And it feels like it kind of rightly orients my mind, which again is how I worship most deeply. And so I find myself keep coming back to both of those resources.
It's good.
That's great. So I do this practice. I hike most mornings, and I kind of start with the first question God asks the man and the woman when he's playing hide and seek in the garden. And he goes, "Where are you?" And so I just spend a few moments just like reflecting, where am I emotionally? What am I holding on to? And then I walk through 4 environments in the Hebrew scripture. So Egypt, in the past 24 hours, where have I felt oppressed or tempted? Sinai, in the past 24 hours, where did God surprise me and meet me? God takes the Hebrew people, takes them to Sinai, then he moves them to Jerusalem. It's a little bit of Spider-Man theology, but like in the past 24 hours, where was I responsible and irresponsible with unique powers and gifts that God has given me? And the Hebrew people weren't. And they find themselves in exile in Babylon. And it's in this moment that I go, in the next 24 hours, what's the next best right step? Do I need to forgive someone? Do I need to call someone? What do I need to do? Because again, it's the athlete in me where I want to make sure that I'm taking steps and I can see my growth. And in the middle of it, it's like a cross, and I just draw a circle at the bottom. I go, what do I need to surrender at the foot of the cross so that I can walk freely and lightly today? It's just a simple, probably 15-minute process, but it just kind of cleans my system. It's like a spiritual detox for me to start my day.
That's cool. So mine's far less spiritual than that. But no joke. I love discovering new expressions of worship people. And so Spotify is it's so good for me. And like just listening to lots of other people's playlists and being introduced to different music is a big one for me. But I think my most and it's so weird. The time I feel most connected with God is before I go to bed. And the reason is oftentimes I'll lay in bed and I'll go, okay, Lord, search my heart. Was there anything in me today that was wayward, that was not honoring to you, that was, I don't want to go to sleep holding on to that. And for a long time in my life, through a really difficult season, me staying connected to God was going, hey God, okay, just search my heart. Was I obedient today? Did I do that next right thing? And this is the contemplative side of me. Like I love evaluating and, everything. Our team will tell you, like, every bit of the service, every bit of all the things that we do. Like,
Yes.
I love evaluating and thinking through, and I do that in my own life as well. Like, I'm very, like, I scour my day, and for me, it was almost a lifeline to go to bed each night going, okay, I was obedient today. Like that, regardless of what the outcomes, regardless of what the circumstances, regardless of what happened, there was a part of me that felt like, okay, God, I was connected to you today in my fellowship of you and my obedience to you. And I could sleep really well regardless of what I was in the middle of. And so that was a big thing.
I think there's something really, really powerful. And if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening, I hope that people are capturing, like, Joel, you're an amazing pastor, you're an amazing preacher, leader, and you have this unique way. And it's like at night when you were told in the morning, this is how you need to do it. You need to get up super early to read. And at the end of the night, this is what you're doing. You've figured out you're an explorer, and so you explore Spotify. You evaluate. There's this contemplative side. Ben, you've got this like cognitive, mental, deep, wanting to like chew and stew on ideas, and I think it's really. I would imagine if I'm listening to this, going, there's 3 different guys, and they do it 3 different ways, and man, maybe there's a new way for me to experience a more thriving life, a more rich relationship with Christ. And I don't know, I'm leaving this conversation with,
and I believe there is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just like that sense of, man, for you, I would just say stay curious and maybe try some stuff out.
Yeah.
Like, is that what you would say?
Yeah,
like,
for sure. In fact, one of the things I was going to finish with is, if you've never even explored this idea of pathways, one of the ways people do that, we're going to put this the link in the notes on YouTube and in the notes for the podcast. But there's an assessment you can take, and some people like assessments, some people don't. But it's just a way for you to help discover maybe how you can connect, how you were wired, how God created you naturally, and you maybe have, you're not doing it wrong, but maybe you're not connecting with God in a way that's most natural to you. And so I think that's the other thing, is we are all different. There we have some similarities, but we're also different, and there's different things that help us to stay connected to the vine. So that may be a place to start. There are all sorts of tools, though, and I just think it's so important for us to stay connected to God's word. That's what people have done since the beginning of time, and whether it was having physical written God's word or holding on to the words that God gave people that were true about themselves, that were true about Him, that were true about life and true about our nature. So something I found recently, and I'll close with this, is the year of the Bible. Like, there's some people who've declared this is the year of the Bible. If you look this up, I think it's yearofthebible.org. But if you go to this website, there's a button up top that says something about gain perspective or something, get perspective. If you click on that, it sort of tells you how to engage the year of the Bible. And there's so many different ways you can engage. And on there, it just gives you 3 simple steps to take to discover ways that you could uniquely engage with the scriptures, which I think, again, is, like, as you said, is one of those fundamentals. Figuring out how to communicate with God, whether it's in the morning, in the afternoon, along the way. This is back to the Hebrew scriptures. Talk about these things. Talk about God in the morning as you go throughout your day, before you lay in bed at night. That's how God wanted us to pass along our faith and to engage in our faith. And so, figuring out how to talk to God through prayer and hear from God through His word. And as Ben, you were saying, stay connected to other people. Those are all part of having a healthy spiritual rhythm. And my guess is you'll begin to find some things maybe similar to us that are helpful in your connection with God, but also you're going to find some things that are completely different than we do, that are there's no prescription for this. There's no right or wrong. It's when, the scripture says that God said, if you'll seek me, you'll find me. And I think this is all part of the seeking process. We're continuing to seek how to better connect with God and to communicate and remain in Him.
I grew up playing sports too, and one of the things that I love that my parents did was they had me in a ton of different sports. And now looking back and looking at the science of it, it's easy to see like, oh, well, that's really brilliant, because you expose kids to different, building different muscles and learning different skills. And now in time, I've gravitated towards the things that I love, but I wouldn't have known that I loved those
right.
had I not tried them out. And so to kind of echo what both of you are saying, take the assessments and learn that way. But there might be some things that you heard here or that you're going, I wonder, am I allowed to try this out as a way to remain in God? And I would say there's so many things that we can try that will help us remain that you may not have even heard of us talk about in this.
That's good. Well, thanks so much for joining us today on our podcast, Steve. Thanks for being here. Ben, thanks for being here with us. We look forward to seeing you next time. If you haven't already, make sure you check out some of the things that are on our website, digital offerings, ways you can engage. We're continuing our series in the meantime this weekend. I'm looking forward to being back for that. And then, as always, each Tuesday night for the foreseeable future, we're gathering online for our nights of prayer and worship. We'd love to see you there to engage with us. We pray that you have an amazing rest of your week, and we'll see you soon online.